The stagecoach door swung open, and Cade Rockwell's entire carefully ordered world shattered in an instant. He had placed one advertisement, just one, a simple notice in the Austin newspaper seeking a housekeeper, a single woman to cook and clean in exchange for wages and shelter. Nothing complicated, nothing that should have disrupted the peaceful solitude he had built on this remote Texas ranch. What stepped down onto his property was not what he had bargained for. Violet Sloan emerged first, mud-splattered and exhausted, her dark eyes holding secrets he could not yet name. She was younger than he had anticipated, perhaps 24, though her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that aged a person beyond their years. Her dress was serviceable gray wool, travel-worn and modest. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. But it was what came next that stopped his heart cold. Two little girls, no more than 5 and 7, clutching her skirts like lifelines. Their wide eyes reflected a terror he recognized all too well, the kind of fear that comes from losing everything and expecting to lose whatever remains. Before we continue this journey through the storm-swept Texas frontier, I invite you to stay with us until the very end. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you are watching from so I can see just how far Violet and Katie's story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The spring of 1882 arrived in Central Texas like an unwelcome guest, loud, insistent, and impossible to ignore. Storm clouds had been building since dawn, stacking themselves against the western horizon in shades of bruised purple and slate gray. By afternoon, they had swallowed the sun whole. Cade Rockwell stood on the wide porch of his ranch house, one shoulder propped against a rough-hewn post, watching the distant road with the patient intensity of a man accustomed to solitude. The wind carried the smell of rain and cedar, whipping his dark hair across his forehead. He did not bother pushing it back. His gray eyes, the color of winter smoke, remained fixed on the ribbon of dirt that wound through his property. The stagecoach was late, not unusual given the weather, but it grated against his sense of order nonetheless. Cade had built his life on predictability, on the reliable rhythm of cattle, land, and honest work. He had placed that advertisement 6 weeks ago with specific requirements. Housekeeper wanted, single woman, room and board provided, reasonable wages, domestic skills required. He had received exactly 3 responses. 2 were barely literate. The third came from a Miss Violet Sloan of San Antonio, written in a careful, educated hand that suggested either genuine refinement or a skillful forgery. Her letter had been brief and professional, curiously devoid of personal detail. She could cook, she could clean, she could manage a household. She required immediate placement and asked no questions about wages or conditions. That last part should have raised flags. In Cade's experience, people who did not ask questions were usually running from answers they did not want to give. But he had been desperate. The house had fallen into benign neglect since his previous housekeeper, old Mrs. Garrett, had moved to Austin to live with her daughter the previous winter. Cade had managed well enough on his own. He was a rancher, not a helpless fool. But the accumulation of unwashed dishes, dusty corners, and shirts mended, then mended again, had finally convinced him that pride was a poor substitute for practicality. The stagecoach finally appeared through the curtain of dust and distance, rocking violently over the rutted road. The driver was pushing the team hard, trying to beat the storm. Cade straightened, watching as the coach clattered into the yard with considerably less dignity than it had likely left Austin with that morning. Mud caked the wheels. One door hung slightly askew. The driver, a grizzled man named Tucker, whom Cade knew from previous supply runs, looked thoroughly done with the day. "Rockwell," Tucker called down, his voice rough as gravel. "Got your delivery. Though I will tell you straight, this is not what your wire specified." Cade's jaw tightened. "Explain." But Tucker was already climbing down, moving to open the passenger door with the weariness of a man who had witnessed too much strangeness to be surprised by any of it. "Best you see for yourself." The door swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a woman's hand appeared, gripping the door frame with white-knuckled intensity. The hand was small, fine-boned, but the grip suggested steel beneath the skin. Violet Sloan stepped down. She met his gaze directly, unflinching despite her obvious exhaustion. Mr. Rockwell, I am Violet Sloan. I apologize for the delay. The storm caused some difficulties on the road. It is not the storm that is the problem, Tucker interrupted, gesturing back toward the coach. It is the extras. Violet's composure cracked for just an instant. Her hand moved to her throat, then dropped. They are with me. Two children emerged from the stagecoach. The first was a girl of perhaps 7, all sharp angles and serious eyes beneath a tangle of brown curls. She descended the steps with the cautious deliberation of someone expecting the ground to disappear beneath her feet. The second child was smaller, 5 maybe, with the same dark eyes but a softer face. Her blonde hair hung in 2 braids, and she clutched a cloth doll with one hand while the other gripped her sister's sleeve. Both girls immediately moved to Violet's seat, pressing against her skirts like small ships seeking harbor. Cade stared. He had prepared for one woman, one housekeeper, one person to manage his household in exchange for fair wages and a roof that did not leak. He had not prepared for this, for the sudden invasion of his carefully maintained solitude by a woman with secrets in her eyes and 2 little girls who looked at him like he might be just another person about to send them away. Mr. Rockwell, Violet said quietly. Her voice held the steady calm of someone making a final stand. I apologize for the lack of notice, if you will allow me to explain. Inside, Cade heard himself say, his voice rougher than intended. Storm is coming. Tucker, help me with the bags. There were not many bags, a single battered trunk and 2 small bundles. Traveling light. Traveling fast. Running. Go on, Cade said, gesturing toward the house. Before the rain hits. Violet hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this constituted acceptance or merely postponement of rejection. Then the first fat raindrops began to fall, and the decision was made for her. She gathered her skirts in one hand, placed her other hand on the older girl's shoulder, and moved toward the porch with the determined stride of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. The younger girl followed, her doll clutched tight. The older girl cast one long, measuring look at Cade, assessing him, filing away information, already calculating risks, before she too climbed the steps. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened completely. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the yard to mud. Lightning split the darkness, followed immediately by thunder so loud the house timbers groaned. The younger girl whimpered and pressed closer to Violet. Cade shouldered open the front door and stood aside. In that moment, watching these 3 strangers enter his home, Cade Rockwell had no idea that everything he had built, everything he had carefully protected himself from, was about to change forever. He had no idea that these 2 little girls and their fierce guardian would become his family. And he had no idea that before the story ended, he would have to fight harder than he ever had in his life to keep them. The interior of the house was dim, cool, and exactly as Cade had left it that morning. Functional, clean enough, but bearing the unmistakable mark of a man living alone. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space all at once, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a heavy wooden table in the center. Violet stepped inside, water dripping from her hem. The girls followed, their eyes huge as they took in their surroundings. Cade noticed the older one's gaze went immediately to the exits, the front door, the back door visible through the kitchen, the windows. She was calculating escape routes. He knew that habit. He had developed it himself during the war. Tucker deposited the trunk with a grunt, tipped his hat to Violet, and ducked back out into the storm. Good luck, Rockwell, he called over the rain. You are going to need it. Then the door closed, and Cade was alone with 3 strangers in a house that had been silent for so long he had forgotten how small it became when filled with other people. Violet drew herself up straighter, which was impressive considering she could not have stood more than 5'4" in her boots. Mr. Rockwell, I owe you honesty. When I applied for this position, I was unaware that circumstances would require me to bring my charges with me. If my presence is unacceptable under these conditions, I understand. But I would ask that you allow us to shelter here until the storm passes and the next stage arrives. Their names, Cade said. Violet blinked. I am sorry? The girls. They have names, I assume. Oh. Something flickered across her face, relief perhaps, that he had not immediately ordered them back into the storm. She placed a hand on the older girl's shoulder. This is Poppy. And this, her hand moved to the younger child's head in a gesture so naturally protective, it spoke of long habit and is May. Poppy and May, Cade repeated. The names hung in the air, making the children reel in a way that simple observation had not. They yours? Another hesitation. They are in my care, which was not an answer. But Cade let it lie. He had plenty of his own questions he did not care to answer. He moved past them to the fireplace, kneeling to build up the fire. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were licking up around the larger logs, casting warm light across the room. The girls inched closer to the heat, though they kept Violet between themselves and Cade like a human shield. You are soaked through, Cade said, still not looking at them. There is a bedroom through that door. Used to be my mother's. Should be linens in the chest, quilts on the bed. Get yourselves dry. I will see about supper. Mr. Rockwell, Violet began. We will talk after you are dry and fed, Cade interrupted. Go on. For a moment he thought she might argue, but then the younger girl, May, sneezed, and that tiny wet sound seemed to tip the balance. Violet nodded once, gathered the girls, and retreated to the bedroom. The door closed softly behind them. Cade remained by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet murmur of voices from the other room. He could make out Violet's low tones, reassuring, and the higher, uncertain responses of the children. What had he gotten himself into? He served the meal in silence. Beans, cornbread, salt pork. Not fancy, but hot and filling. He poured milk for the girls and coffee for himself and Violet. May stared at her plate as if unsure whether she was allowed to eat. Poppy looked to Violet, who nodded once. Only then did the children pick up their spoons. They ate with the focused intensity of people who had known hunger. Not the comfortable, temporary hunger of missing a meal, but the deeper kind. The kind that taught you to never waste food, never take fullness for granted. Cade knew that hunger too. When the edges had been taken off, when May's eyes were growing heavy and Poppy's posture had softened slightly, Violet finally spoke. You are owed an explanation. I am owed honesty, Cade corrected. You can keep your explanations if you like, but if you are staying, even temporarily, I need to know whether someone is going to come looking for these girls, whether there is trouble following you. Violet's hands tightened around her coffee cup. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she lifted her eyes to his. No one is looking for them. Not anymore. They have nowhere else to go. And neither do I. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Their parents, dead. Both of them. There is no other family willing to take them. May's eyes filled with tears, though she made no sound. Poppy put an arm around her sister and glared at Cade with sudden fierceness. Then why the secrecy? Cade pressed, keeping his voice level. Why not mention them in your letter? Because every position I have applied for in the past 6 months has rejected me the moment they learned I came with children. Violet's voice held no self-pity, only tired pragmatism. I thought perhaps if I could prove myself capable first, demonstrate that I could manage the work, you might be willing to reconsider. That is a big assumption. It was the only option I had left, Mr. Rockwell. I have exhausted every other avenue, every charity home, every AIDS society, every possible placement. No one wants 2 girls with no inheritance and no connections. Her voice sharpened with sudden steel. And I will not see them separated or sent to some workhouse where they will be treated as nothing more than free labor. May had begun to cry silently. Poppy's arm tightened around her sister. Cade sat down his coffee cup with deliberate care. How old are you, Poppy? The girl blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. 7, sir. May is 5. And you can read? A cautious nod. Yes, sir. Violet taught us. Can you both work? Age-appropriate work. Collecting eggs, feeding chickens, simple mending. Not heavy labor. Poppy's chin lifted. We can work. We are not useless. Did not say you were. Cade turned his attention back to Violet. What happened to their parents? Fever, last winter. It took their mother first, then their father 3 days later. Violet's voice remained steady, but her knuckles had gone white around her cup. I was their mother's companion. When she fell ill, I cared for her. When she died, I promised I would look after the girls. Their father was not well even before the fever. When he died too, there was nothing left. No money, no property. The landlords sold what little they had to cover back rent. Cade was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. 2 weeks, he said finally. You work. You prove you can manage this house and not interfere with the ranch operation. And we will see about making it permanent. Relief flooded Violet's face. But there are conditions, anything. The girls stay out of the ranch hand's way. They do not wander past the creek to the south or into the north pastures. They listen when I tell them something. This is a working ranch, not a playground. It is dangerous for anyone who does not know what they are doing. Understood. And you, Cade fixed Violet with a hard look, you tell me if someone comes looking. I do not care who they are. If there is trouble, I need to know about it before it arrives on my doorstep. There will not be trouble, Violet said. But something in her eyes suggested she was not entirely certain of that. At the threshold of the bedroom, Poppy turned back. Mr. Rockwell, will you really let us stay? For real? Cade met those serious 7-year-old eyes and saw in them a weariness that no child should have to carry. For now, he said, get some sleep. Cade was alone again in his house, but the silence felt different now. Occupied, changed. 2 weeks turned out to be an entirely inadequate time frame for anything. Not long enough to establish true routines, but just long enough to start depending on them. The first 3 days passed in a flurry of adjustment. Violet attacked the house with the determination of a woman proving her worth, scrubbing floors that did not strictly need scrubbing, reorganizing cupboards, mending curtains that had hung crooked for so long Cade had stopped noticing. She moved through those rooms like a quiet storm, leaving order in her wake. The girls proved more challenging to categorize. May shadowed Violet constantly, rarely speaking above a whisper, her cloth doll always clutched in one small fist. She had nightmares most nights, crying out for a mother who could no longer answer. Violet would go to her, soothing her back to sleep with soft words and gentle hands. But Poppy was different. She observed everything with sharp, calculating eyes, testing boundaries with strategic precision. On the fourth morning, Cade found her in the barn. He had come to check on a mare who seemed off her feed the previous evening. Instead, he discovered Poppy standing outside the stall, perfectly still, watching the horse with focused intensity. She is favoring her left front, Poppy said without turning around, and she keeps looking at her flank. Might be colic. Cade stopped short. How do you know that? My papa had horses. Before. He taught me to watch for signs. The word before carried the weight of everything that had come after. Your papa taught you well. He said horses cannot tell you when something hurts, so you have to learn their language. Cade moved to the stall, running his hand along the mare's neck. She was warm, restless, and yes, definitely favoring that leg. If it is colic, we caught it early. I will walk her. Keep her moving. He paused, considering. You can help if Violet does not need you. Something shifted in Poppy's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. I would like that. So Cade found himself walking circles in the paddock with a 7-year-old girl and a colicky mare, explaining the signs to watch for, the treatments that worked, the delicate balance of knowing when to call the veterinarian from town. Poppy absorbed it all with intensity, asking questions that showed she actually understood what he was telling her wrong. Why did you choose ranching? She asked after they had been walking for an hour. Seemed like honest work. And I like the quiet. Do you still like it? The quiet, I mean. Now that we are here, it was a surprisingly perceptive question from someone so young. Jury is still out. Poppy nodded solemnly. Violet says we have to be very good, that we cannot mess this up because there is nowhere else to go. Your sister know you are worried about that? May does not worry about things the same way I do. She just gets that. Poppy's hand moved to the mare's neck. I have to worry enough for both of us. That is a heavy load for someone your size. Someone has to carry it. She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, and Cade recognized that tone, the voice of someone who had learned too young that survival required sacrifice. By the end of the first week, Cade had stopped thinking of the house as empty when he returned at midday. He had stopped being surprised by the sound of May's laughter, or Poppy's questions, or Violet's quiet humming as she worked. The ranch hands noticed too. Jed commented that the place felt livelier. Even gruff old Sam admitted it was nice to smell fresh bread when the wind blew right. On Sunday, Violet prepared a dinner that brought all 5 ranch hands up to the house with their hats in their hands and genuine gratitude in their eyes. Pot roast with vegetables from the newly revived garden. Fresh rolls, dried apple pie that made young Billy declare he had died and gone to heaven. The men were respectful, careful not to curse, patient when May shyly offered them more coffee with trembling hands. Cade watched from the head of the table, saying little but noting everything. The way Violet moved through the room with quiet confidence. The way Poppy sat up straighter when the hands complimented her help with the vegetables. The way May's smile grew wider each time someone thanked her. The way his house had stopped feeling like a place he simply existed and started feeling like something else entirely. That evening, Cade helped Violet with the dishes, an offer that clearly surprised her. They worked in companionable silence, her washing, him drying. "We are past halfway through your trial," Violet said suddenly. "I suppose you will be making your decision soon?" Cade set down the plate he had been drying. "And if I asked you to stay permanently?" Violet's hands stilled in the wash water. "Are you asking? Considering it?" She turned to face him. "You have made it clear you value your solitude. We are the opposite of that. We are noise and complication and disruption. Why would you willingly choose that?" It was a fair question. "Place needs a housekeeper," Cade said finally. "You are good at the work. The girls are not as much trouble as I expected." "Seems practical." "Practical." Violet's mouth twisted slightly. "That is your reason? You want a different one?" "I want the truth, Cade. Because if we stay, if we make this permanent, I need to know we are not just a convenience that you will regret when the newness wears off." Cade leaned back against the counter. "This place has been dead quiet for years. Since before the war, really. After I came back, I thought that was what I wanted. No noise, no demands, no one needing anything from me. And it worked for a while." He paused, frustrated by his inability to articulate what he was feeling. "This house was built for a family. My parents raised 4 kids here. After they died, after my brothers and sister moved on, it has just been me. And I did not realize how much that mattered until you 3 showed up and reminded me what it used to sound like." Violet stared at him. "That is the most I have heard you say at one time since we arrived. Do not get used to it. If we stay, and I am not saying we will, but if we do, I need you to understand something. Those girls have lost everyone. They have been passed over, rejected, told they are burdens. If we stay, they are going to start hoping. Start believing this is real. And if you change your mind later, it will break them in ways I am not sure they can recover from." "I do not make offers I do not intend to keep," Kate said quietly. "If I ask you to stay, it is because I mean it. Then ask me properly, not considering it or seems practical. Ask me like you mean it." Cade held her gaze. "Stay, all 3 of you, not as a trial, as permanent residents of this ranch. I will pay fair wages, provide room and board, and make sure those girls have what they need." For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then from inside, May's voice piped up. "Violet, can we stay? Please, can we stay?" Neither adult had realized the girls were listening. Poppy stood too, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands clenched tight. Violet looked at Cade one more time, searching his face for something. "Yes," she said to the girls. "We can stay." May's shriek of joy was loud enough to startle the chickens in their coop. Poppy moved more slowly, but her tight control had cracked enough to let genuine relief show through. She crossed to Cade and stuck out her hand. "Thank you, sir. We will not let you down." Cade shook her small hand gravely. "I know." That night, Cade sat alone on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. He had just permanently altered the course of his carefully controlled life, taken on responsibility for 3 people who were basically strangers, committed himself to noise and complication and all the messy unpredictability he had worked so hard to avoid. And somehow it did not feel like a mistake. It felt like the house had just started breathing properly again after years of holding its breath. Morning came with the relentless brightness peculiar to Texas after a storm. Cade woke before dawn, as always, to the sound of roosters and the restless lowing of cattle in the near pasture. He dressed quickly and emerged from his bedroom to find the main room empty. Then he heard the voices, angry voices, coming from the kitchen. Cade was out of bed and moving before his brain fully caught up with his instincts. But when he threw open his bedroom door, what he found was not an intruder or an accident. It was a woman, tall, imposing, dressed in black silk that must have cost more than most families earned in a month. She stood in his kitchen like she owned it, holding a piece of paper in one gloved hand. "You cannot seriously expect me to believe you are providing adequate care," the woman was saying. Her voice dripped with cultivated disdain. "Living in this primitive situation, no proper schooling, no suitable society. They have everything they need," Violet said. Her voice was shaking, but firm. The girls were behind her, both in their nightgowns, both pressed against her like they were trying to disappear. "Who the hell are you, ho?" Cade's voice cut through the room like a blade. The woman's attention snapped to him. Her expression shifted from disdain to calculation in an instant. "Mr. Rockwell, I presume. I am Helena Whitmore, maternal aunt to these children, and I have come to take them home where they belong." Everything in the room went very still. "They are home," Violet whispered. Helena Whitmore's smile was thin and cold. "We will see what the court has to say about that, will we not? I have a lawyer, Miss Sloan, and evidence that you have been harboring these children without proper legal authority." She produced another paper from her bag, unfolding it with deliberate slowness. "This is an affidavit signed by 3 witnesses, testifying to your unstable situation, moving from place to place, no permanent address, no means of support until quite recently." Helena's eyes gleamed with triumph. "And there is the matter of your deception, telling everyone these children were yours, when in fact they are not your daughters at all, are they, Miss Sloan? They are your half-sisters." The words hit like physical blows. "Born to your father and his second wife after your mother's death. Half-sisters you appropriated after their parents died, with no legal right whatsoever." The room spun. Cade's gaze snapped to Violet, who had gone white as death. "That is not," Violet started, but her voice failed. "It is all documented," Helena continued smoothly. "Their parents' marriage certificate, birth records, your father's will, which made no provision for you, the illegitimate daughter he barely acknowledged." Helena's voice sharpened with cruelty. "Tell me, Miss Sloan, what exactly gives you the right to determine these children's future when you are nothing but a bastard your father refused to claim?" May began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Poppy's jaw was clenched so tight Cade thought her teeth might crack. "Get out," Cade said. His voice was deadly quiet. "Get out of my house, now. This does not concern you, Mr. Rockwell. These children are blood relations. I intend to see them properly placed." "I said get out. I will be back," Helena said, "with the sheriff and proper documentation. And when I return, those children will be leaving with me." She paused at the threshold, looking back at Violet with something that might have been pity if it were not so thoroughly coated in contempt. "You should have known better than to think you could keep them. Girls like you never get to keep anything." Then she was gone. The silence after her departure was absolute. "Violet," Cade began, "do not." She held up a shaking hand. "Please, just do not." She gathered the girls and retreated to the bedroom. The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Cade stood alone in his kitchen, staring at the space where Helena Whitmore had stood. Half-sisters, legal challenges, a past Violet had never mentioned, and secrets that were apparently about to tear his household apart. Behind him, he heard the bedroom door open, footsteps. Then Violet's voice, raw and broken. "I should pack. We will be gone by afternoon. I am sorry, Cade. I am so sorry." He turned to find her standing in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her face blotchy with tears she had tried to hide. "No," he said. Violet blinked. "What?" I said no. "You are not packing. You are not leaving. And you are sure as hell not giving up without a fight." He walked toward her. "That woman came into my house, threatened people under my protection. That does not stand. Not on my land. You do not understand," Violet whispered. "She is right. I have no legal claim to them. Their parents never formally adopted me. I am just their father's bastard daughter. I have no rights here. Then we will get you rights." "How, Cade? She has lawyers. She has money. She has standing in society. I have nothing. You have me. And maybe that is enough. Violet stared at him. Why would you do this? Why would you fight for us? Because in 2 weeks, you three have made this house feel more like home than it has in 10 years, Cade thought. But what he said was simpler. Because it is right. Because those girls deserve better than being used as pawns. And because I am not in the habit of letting bullies win. He reached out and did something he had never done before. Touched her face, his rough, calloused hand cradling her cheek with surprising gentleness. We will figure this out, Violet. Together. But you have to trust me. A tear slid down her cheek. I do, she whispered. God help me, I do. From the bedroom, Poppy's voice called out. Violet, are we really leaving? No, sweetheart, Violet called back, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. We are staying. We are going to fight. The morning stretched into afternoon with the weight of unspoken dread hanging over everything. Kate had left shortly after dawn, muttering something about town and business that needed handling. He returned 3 hours later with Sheriff Tom Bridger, a weathered man in his 50s whose steady eyes and calm demeanor suggested he had seen enough trouble to know the difference between real threats and empty ones. Now they sat around the kitchen table. Cade, Violet, and the sheriff. The girls played quietly in the corner. Mrs. Whitmore came to see me this morning, Sheriff Bridger said. Had quite a story about stolen children and fraudulent guardianship. Wanted me to remove those girls immediately. He paused. I told her I would need to investigate the situation before taking any action. Due diligence, I said. And Cade's jaw was tight. I am here to hear your side, Miss Sloan, because Helena Whitmore strikes me as a woman more interested in winning than in what is actually right. Violet drew a deep breath and began to speak. My mother was a seamstress in Richmond. She died when I was 12. Before she passed, she told me my father was a gentleman named Thomas Hartwell. He had promised to marry her, but married someone else instead when his family arranged a better match. She never asked him for anything. Never told him she was carrying his child. She raised me alone. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes had gone distant. After she died, I had no one. I ended up in a charity home until I was 16. Then worked as a maid, a seamstress's assistant, whatever I could find. I never contacted Thomas Hartwell. I wanted nothing from him. But he found you, the sheriff said. His wife died when I was 20. He hired investigators to locate me. I never knew why. Guilt, perhaps. He asked me to come to San Antonio, offered me employment as a companion to his new wife. She paused. Margaret Hartwell was young, frail, and kind. She was also pregnant with Poppy. When Poppy was born, she asked me to be her godmother. When May came 2 years later, the same. And when she grew sicker, she relied on me more and more. Where was the aunt during all this? In Boston. She and Margaret were not close. Helena visited once shortly after May was born. Made it clear she disapproved of everything. The modest household. The children themselves. She said Poppy was too willful and May too delicate. Margaret asked her to leave. They had not spoken since. So when the fever came, Sheriff Bridger said, Margaret died first. She made me promise to look after the girls, to make sure they stayed together. Thomas was devastated. He caught the fever 3 days later. Before he died, he was delirious. But he called for me, held my hand, and whispered, They are yours now. Violet's voice cracked. I do not know if he meant it legally, but I kept my promise to Margaret. Did he leave a will? If he did, I never saw it. The landlord came within a week demanding back rent. There was no money, no property. He sold the furniture to cover what was owed. I took the girls and what few belongings we could carry, and we left. And you have been running ever since, Kate said quietly. I tried to find legitimate placement. I went to orphanages, aid societies, church groups. Everyone said the same thing. They could not take two sisters together. Some wanted to separate them immediately. I could not let that happen. Sheriff Bridger sat back. Here's the situation as I see it. Mrs. Whitmore has legal standing as a blood relative. You have no formal legal claim to these children. In a court, that puts you at a disadvantage. Violet's face went pale. However, the sheriff continued, the law also considers the best interests of the children. And from what I can see, these girls are well cared for, healthy, educated, and clearly attached to you. That counts for something. So what do? We document everything. Violet, write out a full account of your relationship with these girls. Get statements from anyone who knew you in San Antonio, anyone who can testify to your care. The sheriff turned to Cade. And I will need to know your role in this, why you are housing them, what your intentions are. It is permanent, Cade said without hesitation. They are part of my household. They are under my protection. After the sheriff left, Violet sat at the table, staring at blank paper. She is not bluffing, Violet said quietly. Helena has money, connections. She can drag this through courts for years. Cade was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. We need to change the situation. Make it harder for them to separate you from the girls. How? We need to make you family. Legally. He paused. We need to get married. Violet stared at him like he had lost his mind. What? Think about it. As my wife, you would have legal standing. The girls would be under my protection as your husband. Helena cannot claim you are unfit if you are a married woman with a stable home. That is insane. You cannot marry someone just to win a legal battle. Why not? People get married for worse reasons. At least this would be for something that matters. It does not have to be real, Cade continued. Not in the ways that matter to you. We can keep separate rooms, maintain whatever distance you need, but on paper you would be Mrs. Rockwell, and those girls would be as good as mine. You do not know what you are offering, Violet said, her voice breaking. Marriage is permanent, Cade. You cannot throw that away on a legal strategy. Who says I am throwing it away? The words came out rougher than he intended. You have been here nearly 3 weeks. In that time, this house has felt more like home than it has in a decade. Those girls have brought life back to a place that was slowly dying. And you? He stopped. What exactly about that makes you unsuitable for marriage? I am illegitimate, unmarriageable by society's standards. If you do this, you will be tying yourself to someone with a shameful past. I do not give a damn about society's standards. Never have. He moved closer. Here is what I know. Those girls need you. You need protection. And I need this house to keep breathing the way it has been. I need to know that when I come back from the far pastures, there will be voices and laughter and someone who cares whether I made it home safe. That is not love, Violet whispered. Maybe not, but it is honest. And it is more than most people start with. He took her hand. I am not offering you romance, Violet, but I can offer you partnership, respect, protection, a home for those girls that nobody can take away. From inside, May's voice called out, Violet, is everything all right? Violet closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Cade saw the moment she made her decision. All right, she said quietly. If you are sure, then yes, I will marry you. We will do it tomorrow. I will ride to town first thing. Get the license. Find a judge. Can you be ready by afternoon? Violet laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. I own 2 dresses and a pair of boots. I am about as ready as I will ever be. That is all you need. She turned toward the house. Cade, thank you for fighting for us. I know it is just a strategy, but thank you. She disappeared inside before he could tell her that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being just a strategy. The wedding took place in Judge Harrison's chambers at precisely 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Violet wore her best dress, the gray wool she had arrived in, cleaned and pressed until it looked almost respectable. May had woven wildflowers into her braid that morning, yellow and purple blooms that softened the severity of her appearance. Poppy stood beside her in somber silence, holding May's hand with white-knuckled intensity. Cade had worn his cleanest shirt and the jacket he kept for funerals and bank meetings. He felt stiff and ridiculous in clothes that did not smell of horses and honest sweat. Sheriff Bridger stood as witness, along with Jed from the ranch. Both men wore expressions that suggested they understood exactly what this hasty marriage really was. A legal maneuver, a defensive strategy, a last desperate play before the enemy closed in. Judge Harrison kept the ceremony brief. Do you, Cade Rockwell, take this woman? Do you, Viola Sloan, take this man? The promises to honor, to cherish, in sickness and health felt both weightless and impossibly heavy. When the judge pronounced them married and suggested Cade might kiss his bride, there was a moment of awkward hesitation. Then Cade leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Violet's forehead, brief and almost brotherly. Violet's eyes closed at the contact. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. The ride back to the ranch was subdued. Spring sunshine painted the prairie in shades of golden green, but the beauty felt disconnected from the tension in Cade's chest. Beside him, Violet sat straight back, her new wedding ring catching the light. "You did not have to buy a ring," she said quietly. "Yes, I did. People notice things like that. Helena's lawyers will be looking for any detail they can use to prove this marriage is not legitimate." "Is it? Legitimate, I mean. We stood before a judge and said words. But we both know why we did it. Does that count as real?" Cade kept his eyes on the road. "Real enough to hold up in court. That is all that matters right now." "Right," Violet's voice had gone flat. "That is all that matters." They had barely unhitched the wagon when riders appeared on the eastern road. 3 of them, moving fast. Cade recognized his cousin Quentin's buggy, flanked by 2 hired men. Rough-looking characters clearly there for intimidation. "Get the girls inside," Cade said quietly to Violet. "Philip, stay there until I call for you." Violet gathered the girls without argument, hurrying them toward the house. Cade stood alone in his yard, waiting. Jed emerged from the barn, rifle held casually but available. Quentin pulled up in a cloud of dust. "Cousin," Quentin called out with false cheer. "Congratulations are in order, I hear. Married just this afternoon. How romantically impulsive. State your business." "Then get off my land. My business is simple. I am here on behalf of Mrs. Whitmore to collect her nieces. She has legal custody papers. The children are to come with me immediately. Those children are under my protection now, as my wife's sisters, their family." Quentin's smile sharpened. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong. You see, I did some digging after our last conversation. Very enlightening." He pulled out a document. "The county records. Did you know your father's estate was never properly probated? That his will contained certain ambiguities about property division?" Cade's jaw clenched. "That is a lie. My father left this ranch to me." "Did he, or did he leave it to his sons, plural? Because your brothers never formally signed away their claims, Cade, which means technically you have been operating this ranch without clear title for years." Quentin's pause was theatrical. "Unless we can come to an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "You release the children to their rightful guardian, and I withdraw my property claims." "Everyone benefits." Sheriff Bridger's voice cut through the tension. He had ridden up quietly, positioning his horse between Quentin's men and Cade. "Because it sounds to me like you are attempting extortion, Mr. Rockwell. That is a serious crime." "Extortion? Sheriff, I am simply trying to resolve a family dispute." "This is not over," Quentin said, his voice low and venomous. "Mrs. Whitmore has resources you cannot match. She will bury you in legal fees. And while you are fighting her, I will be dismantling your claim to this ranch piece by piece." "Maybe, but not today. Get off my land, Quentin." Quentin held his gaze for a long moment. "You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, Mrs. Whitmore files formal custody proceedings, and I file formal property claims. Think carefully about whether you want to fight both battles simultaneously." They left in another cloud of dust. After the sheriff left, Violet emerged from the house. "How bad is it?" "Bad, but not impossible." Cade looked at the land he had fought to keep, the ranch he had built from nothing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was always more work to be done, always something needing attention. But tonight they were together. Tonight they were home, and that was worth fighting for. The week that followed was a blur of preparation and mounting dread. Cade hired a lawyer from Austin, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, who specialized in family law and had a reputation for taking cases others considered unwinnable. She arrived on the 3rd day, spent 6 hours reviewing documents and interviewing everyone, then delivered her assessment with brutal honesty. "You have a case," she said. "Not a strong one, but a case. The marriage helps significantly. It establishes Violet as a respectable married woman rather than an unwed guardian. Cade's standing in the community helps. The testimony about Helena's absence and Violet's devoted care helps. But Helena has blood relation, financial resources, and social standing. In custody disputes, blood still matters a great deal to most judges. So what do? We tell your story. All of it. We make the judge see that you are not some opportunistic stranger. You are their sister, their mother in everything but legal documentation, the person their own mother chose to protect them. Over the next days, the ranch became headquarters for their defense. Sheriff Bridger came by with additional statements. Jed and the other hands wrote testimonials about the girl's care and the positive changes in the household. The pastor from town agreed to testify about Violet's character. Even the shopkeeper offered supportive statements. Through it all, Violet moved with mechanical precision, cooking, cleaning, caring for the girls, writing her timeline in careful script that grew less steady as she reached the parts about Margaret's death and Thomas's final words. At night, Kate could hear her crying through the thin wall that separated their rooms. Quiet, contained sobs that she tried to muffle. He wanted to go to her, to offer comfort or at least companionship, but he had promised her space. Promised this marriage could be whatever she needed it to be. On the night before the hearing, Cade found Violet sitting on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. "Cannot sleep?" he asked, settling onto the step beside her. "Do not want to. Feels like if I stay awake, I can keep tomorrow from coming." Does not work that way, unfortunately. I know. Violet pulled her shawl tighter. "I keep thinking about what Margaret Chen said, that we have to humanize this, make it about the girl's well-being. But what if that is not enough? What if the judge looks at me and just sees what Helena wants him to see? A bastard pretending to be something she is not. Is that what you think you are?" "It is what I have been told I am my entire life." Cade was quiet for a moment. "When I came back from the war, I was broken in ways I could not explain. Lost friends, lost my faith in pretty much everything. Could not see the point of trying to build something when it could all be destroyed so easily." He paused. "But you know what I learned? You cannot live your whole life avoiding risk just because you have been hurt before. You cannot let the worst parts of your past define who you are forever. Is that what you have done? Decided you are worth more? I am working on it. Having you three here, that has helped. Made me remember that isolation is not the same thing as safety, that sometimes the risk is worth it, even when the risk is losing everything, especially then." Cade met her eyes. "Tomorrow we go into that courtroom and we tell the truth. We show that judge what family really means. Not blood, not legal documents, but the choice to show up every day and love someone even when it is hard." "And what does it make you?" Violet asked softly. "To them?" The question hung in the air. "I do not know yet," he said honestly, "but I would like the chance to find out." Violet's hand found his in the darkness. Her fingers laced through his with surprising firmness. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on while the night deepened around them. Inside, May cried out in her sleep. They heard Poppy's voice, low and soothing, comforting her sister. The sound of it strengthened something in Cade's chest. Tomorrow they would fight. Tomorrow they would face judges and lawyers and people who wanted to tear this fragile thing apart. But tonight they were together. Tonight they were home. Dawn arrived too quickly. The courthouse sat in the center of town, an imposing brick structure that looked far too official for the rough frontier community it served. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. Curious townspeople, supporters who had come to testify, and Helena Whitmore herself. She stood on the courthouse steps, resplendent in black silk, flanked by Quentin and two other men in expensive suits. Her eyes found Violet as the wagon pulled up. Her expression shifted into something that might have been triumph if it had not been so cold. "Mrs. Rockwell," Helena called out, "how lovely that you could make it. And you have brought the children. How convenient. They can leave with me directly once the judge makes the sensible decision." Poppy's hand tightened on Violet so hard it must have hurt. May pressed her face into Cade's side. Cade felt something fierce surge through him. "They are not going anywhere with you. Not now, not ever. We will see what Judge Morrison has to say about that." The courtroom was smaller than Cade had expected. Wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. Windows that let in harsh morning light. Judge Morrison was already seated at the bench. A man in his 60s with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Helena's lawyers presented their case first. They painted Violet as an opportunistic imposter who had stolen children that did not belong to her, hidden them away on a remote ranch. manufactured a hasty marriage to avoid consequences. They produced birth certificates proving Helena's blood relation, letters from Boston society members testifying to her character, financial statements showing she could provide the girls with advantages far beyond what a frontier rancher could offer. Through it all, Violet sat rigid beside Cade, her face pale but composed. Then it was Margaret Chen's turn. Your Honor, this case is not about blood relation or financial resources. It is about what is best for two little girls who have already lost more than children should have to lose. She moved to stand beside Violet. Mrs. Whitmore claims to be concerned about their welfare now. But where was she when they were grieving? Where was she when they had nowhere to sleep? Where was she during the 6 months Mrs. Rockwell sacrificed everything to keep them together? The answer is simple. She was not there. Margaret turned back to the judge. Mrs. Rockwell has cared for these children with devotion that goes beyond duty. She is their sister by blood, their father's daughter, the person their mother chose as guardian on her deathbed. To tear them away now would be cruel and traumatic. This court exists to protect children, not to serve the vindictive purposes of relatives who could not be bothered to care until it became legally advantageous. She pulled out documents. I have testimony from Sheriff Bridger about Mrs. Whitmore's threatening behavior, statements from community members, and most importantly, I have the children themselves who can tell you exactly where they want to be. Judge Morrison leaned back. I would like to hear from the children. But separately, without either party present, Cade felt Violet tense beside him. It will be all right, he whispered. They are strong. They know what to say. But watching Poppy and May disappear into the judge's chambers, their small hands clasped together, Cade felt his certainty waver. The wait was excruciating. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 45. Helena looked increasingly confident. Quentin kept glancing at Cade with barely concealed satisfaction. Finally, the door opened. Judge Morrison emerged alone, his expression unreadable. I have spoken with both children at length, he said. They are articulate, intelligent, and remarkably clear about their feelings. Before I render my decision on the custody matter, I would like to address the property dispute. He turned to Quentin. Mr. Rockwell, you have filed claims suggesting irregularities in your cousin's title. I have reviewed the documentation. Your claims are without merit. The water rights are clearly assigned to the main ranch property. Your attempt to contest these established property rights appears to be nothing more than harassment designed to create leverage in an unrelated custody dispute. Your property claims are dismissed. Quentin's face had gone red. The judge turned to Helena. As for you, Mrs. Whitmore, I have some questions. When was the last time you saw these children before arriving in Texas? Helena straightened. I visited approximately 5 years ago. And you maintained regular correspondence with their mother afterward? Inquired about their well-being? Helena's jaw tightened. My sister and I were not close. So the answer is no. You had no contact with these children for 5 years. Yet when they became orphans, suddenly you developed deep concern for their welfare. Why is that? They are my blood, Your Honor. Family obligation. Family obligation is a curious thing. It seems to activate very selectively for some people. He leaned forward. Tell me, if I were to grant you custody, what are your plans for these girls? I would take them to Boston, enroll them in proper schools, introduce them to appropriate society. Together? Helena hesitated for just a moment. While their ages and temperaments differ significantly, it might be more suitable to place them in separate educational environments. So you would separate them. The judge's voice had gone flat. These two little girls who have already lost their parents, who have been through upheaval and uncertainty, who clearly depend on each other. You would tear them apart for the sake of suitable education. It would be in their best interest long term. Would it? Or would it simply be more convenient for Yuko? Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, I have been a judge for 23 years. I have seen a lot of custody disputes, and I have learned that blood relation does not automatically confer wisdom or love. Sometimes the people who fight hardest for custody are the ones who should never have it. He paused. I spoke with Poppy and May Hartwell this morning. Poppy is 7 years old, but she has the gravity of someone much older. May is 5, still young enough to believe in safety, but old enough to know when it is threatened. And you know what they told me? The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. They told me that Violet is their mother, not the woman who gave birth to them, the person who mothers them now, who sits up with them through nightmares, who teaches them their letters, who makes sure they feel wanted and safe. They told me that Cade is teaching them about horses and ranching and how to be strong when things are hard. They also told me that they do not know you, Mrs. Whitmore, that the one time you visited, you made their mother cry, and that they are terrified you will separate them and send them away from the only home they have left. Judge Morrison picked up his gavel. Therefore, I hereby deny Mrs. Whitmore's petition for custody. Legal guardianship of Poppy and May Hartwell is granted to Violet Rockwell with full parental rights and responsibilities. The gavel fell. We won, Violet whispered. Oh God, Cade, we won. I told you we would. The ride back to the ranch was jubilant. May chattered nonstop about how the judge had asked her about her doll and whether she liked feeding chickens. How she had told him that Cade was teaching them to be brave. Poppy was quieter, but kept stealing glances at Cade and Violet with something that looked like cautious wonder. By the time they pulled into the ranch yard, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The hands emerged from the bunkhouse, and Jed took one look at their faces before letting out a whoop. We won, May shouted back, her voice high and clear with joy. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey saved for special occasions. The hands took turns congratulating Violet and shaking Cade's hand. Even Gruff Sam admitted that the ranch felt better with children around. As evening settled over the land, Cade found himself on the porch again, watching the prairie fade into twilight. Violet joined him after getting the girls settled. They were silent for a long moment. I keep expecting to wake up, Violet said finally. Keep expecting this to be a dream. It is real. You are allowed to believe that now. I do not know if I know how. I have spent so long waiting for the next disaster. Violet turned to look at him. You saved us, Cade. You know that, right? We would have lost without you. You would have found another tree. You are too stubborn to give up, maybe. But I would not have had this. She gestured at the ranch, the house, the land stretching endlessly in every direction. I would not have had a real home to fight for. And I would not have had a partner. Someone who stood beside me instead of just feeling sorry for me. Violet moved closer. I know we got married for legal reasons. I know you said it did not have to be real. But Cade? She looked up at him. It feels real to me. Has for a while now. And if you do not feel the same way, that is fine. I can keep it to myself. Cade cut off her words by doing what he had wanted to do since the moment she had stood in his kitchen, defending those girls with every ounce of strength she possessed. He cupped her face in his rough, scarred hands and kissed her. It was not the chaste, brotherly kiss from their wedding ceremony. It was real and deep and full of all the things he had been too scared to put into words. When he finally pulled back, Violet was staring at him with wide eyes. It is real to me too, he said quietly. Has been since somewhere around the second week. Maybe earlier. You mean that? I have not lied to you yet, have I? No, you have not. Then trust me now. He kissed her again, softer this time. A promise rather than a declaration. Stay with me, Violet. Not because you have to. Not because it is legally convenient. But because you want to. Build this life with me. For real. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I want all of it. From inside the house came the sound of Poppy's voice, calling out that May was asking for one more story before sleep. Violet laughed and pulled away reluctantly. Duty calls, go. I will be there in a minute. Cade watched her disappear inside, heard her greeting the girls with warmth and affection, heard their excited voices, the sounds of family, of home, of a life he had stopped believing he could have. He headed inside to find Violet sitting on May's bed, book open in her lap. Both girls curled up beside her, listening with rapt attention. Poppy looked up as he entered and silently shifted over, making room. He settled onto the bed's edge. And without missing a beat in her reading, Violet reached out and took his hand. May's eyes were already drooping. Poppy fought sleep with characteristic determination, but was losing the battle. This was it, Cade realized. This ordinary, perfect moment. After all the fighting and fear and uncertainty, they had arrived at something achingly simple. A family sitting together at the end of a long day. Just being. When the story ended and both girls had finally surrendered to sleep, Cade and Violet tucked them in together. They stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back. Poppy with one arm flung over her head, May curled around her doll. Both of them safe and settled and home. Our girls, Violet whispered. Our girls, Kate agreed. And the word felt right, felt true in a way that legal documents and judges' rulings never could be. They retreated to their own room. Not separate rooms anymore. The one they would share. Are you sure? Violet asked quietly. About all of this? Cade pulled her close. I have never been more sure of anything. You are mine, Violet Rockwell, and I am yours. For real this time. No more pretending, she agreed and kissed him. Outside, the Texas night stretched endlessly in all directions, full of possibility and promise. And inside the house that had been silent for so long, four hearts beat in comfortable harmony. They had won more than custody today. They had won the right to be a family. Messy, complicated, unconventional, but undeniably real. Home was not a place you defended. It was the people you chose to defend it with, and Cade had chosen well.